This was the reality for the British Redcoats during the American Revolution, a conflict where the very strategies that once made them invincible now became their greatest disadvantage. Every march was a battle with the land itself, and every victory felt like a fleeting moment of triumph in a war that seemed endless. The British Army, so used to marching in neat rows and dominating on the open field, found themselves trapped in an unconventional war they weren't prepared for. The Americans, fueled by their desire for freedom, used every element of their environment against them, forcing the British to fight a war not just on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of an entire population. This wasn't just a war for independence, it was a nightmare for the British, and a defining moment in the history of warfare that would change the world forever. Introduction to guerrilla warfare. Define what guerrilla warfare is and how it contrasts with traditional European warfare. The Americans utilized hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, and surprise attacks. Impact on British strategies. Discuss how the British were trained for open field battles and the problems they encountered when faced with these new tactics. Examples of guerrilla tactics. Provide examples such as the Battle of Concord, where American forces used the terrain to their advantage. Explore how these tactics disrupted British formations and forced them to re-evaluate their approach. Psychological warfare. Analyze how these tactics also wore down the morale of British troops, who were accustomed to more straightforward conventional fights. Adaptation and resistance. Discuss the eventual British response to guerrilla tactics, such as trying to suppress local militias or using loyalists. Were these successful? Geographical disadvantages. Highlight the challenges the British faced while fighting on foreign soil. The vast American landscape with its forests, rivers, and mountains posed significant hurdles. Unfamiliar terrain. Discuss how the British soldiers, though trained for European conditions, were unfamiliar with the conditions in America. Lack of knowledge about local geography often meant getting lost or unprepared for weather and topography. Supply chain problems. Expand on how Britain's long supply lines, especially across the Atlantic Ocean, made it difficult to sustain troops. Discuss the issues of communication and reinforcement delays. Home field advantage for Americans. Contrast the British struggle with the American advantage of local knowledge. This helped the revolutionaries execute effective ambushes and set traps, like the Battle of Bunker Hill. The cost of occupation. Discuss the impact of occupying American cities and the resentment it caused among locals. Even though the British controlled cities like New York and Philadelphia, the growing hostilities undermined British morale. Supply lines and communication. Examine the logistical challenges of maintaining a supply chain over the ocean. Delays in shipments of food, equipment, and reinforcements caused British forces to suffer from hunger and depletion of resources. Transportation issues. Detail the difficulty of moving troops, weapons, and supplies across a vast continent with inadequate infrastructure. The British had to rely on poor roads and limited transport options. Loss of resources. Discuss instances where British resources were intercepted and how American forces targeted British supply lines. The loss of vital supplies weakened the British ability to continue operations. The role of local support. Explain how the lack of consistent loyalist support further exacerbated the British logistical problems. They couldn't rely on local populations to help them sustain their army or provide necessary supplies. The impact on strategy. Analyze how the logistical difficulties forced the British to change their strategies, often making them more reactive than proactive. Expectations versus reality. The British expected to receive much more support from loyalists and American colonists who were still loyal to the crown. Examine why this didn't materialize. The American spirit of resistance. Highlight the growing American spirit of independence and how many previously neutral or undecided colonists chose to support the revolutionaries over the British. Failed British recruitment. Discuss efforts to recruit local militias and the challenges the British faced in trying to raise support among the local population. How were these efforts often undermined by distrust or fear? Propaganda and its impact. Analyze how the British used propaganda to try and sway local support. What effect did it have? How did American propaganda counteract this? The role of the Continental Congress. Discuss the leadership of the Continental Congress and how it successfully united various colonial factions under one cause. French support. Explore how the French became crucial allies to the American cause, both diplomatically and militarily. How did they provide arms, supplies, and naval support? Strategic importance of France's entry. Analyze the strategic impact of France's involvement. How did it force Britain to fight on multiple fronts and divert resources from the American conflict to deal with France? The Battle of Saratoga. Discuss how the American victory at Saratoga was a turning point, leading to France officially entering the war on the side of the colonies. Spain and the Dutch. Briefly touch on the role of Spain and the Dutch in the conflict, supporting the Americans indirectly by attacking British holdings elsewhere. How this affected British plans. Explain the impact of foreign intervention on British military strategies and the added pressure of fighting an international coalition, not just American forces. Initial British assumptions. Explore how the British initially underestimated the ability and will of the American forces, believing that their superior training and resources would easily defeat the colonies. Underestimating colonial unity. Discuss how the British failed to recognize the growing unity among the colonies, which united under the Continental Congress to form a strong resistance. Strategic errors. Detail key. British strategic mistakes due to overconfidence, such as the decision to concentrate forces in certain cities instead of engaging in a broader campaign. Fighting a popular rebellion. Examine how the British were slow to realize they weren't fighting just an army but a popular rebellion supported by the majority of the population. The stubbornness of British command. Discuss how the British High Command remained stubborn and relied on outdated tactics, leading to significant losses. The long duration of the war. Explore how the war dragged on for years and became a financial and military drain for Britain. This affected public opinion and the morale of the British troops. Rising costs. Discuss the financial strain the war caused for Britain, forcing them to raise taxes and borrow money to fund the conflict. This led to political unrest back home. The strain on British resources. Highlight the toll the war took on British resources, including troops, ships, and funding, and how it was challenging to sustain operations over a long period. Dwindling support for the war effort. Examine how public opinion in Britain shifted as the war continued, leading to increasing anti-war sentiment. Impact on British soldiers. Analyze the physical and psychological toll the war took on British soldiers, who faced constant battles and hardships without any clear end in sight. British command structure. Examine the differences in leadership within the British command structure. Some commanders, like General Clinton, were more adaptable, while others, like General Howe, failed to adjust to the unique challenges of the war. Poor decision-making. Discuss how British leaders often made poor decisions based on outdated European tactics and failed to understand the dynamics of the American battlefield. Conflicting objectives. Highlight how British commanders had different strategic objectives and how this led to confusion and inefficiency in their operations. Disunity within the ranks. Explore how the British command was often disunified, with different generals pursuing their own agendas, causing strategic misalignments. The lack of innovation. Analyze how British commanders failed to innovate or adapt, relying too heavily on conventional European strategies that weren't effective in the American context. The terrain of North America. Discuss the challenges posed by North America's unique terrain, dense forests, rivers, mountains, and swamps, and how this affected the movement of British forces. Difficulties in navigation. Highlight how British soldiers trained in open fields struggled with navigating the wilderness and getting lost in unfamiliar territory. The climate factor. Analyze how the American climate, with its extreme heat, cold, and unpredictable weather patterns, further hampered the British efforts. Tactical disadvantages. Explore how the terrain gave the Americans a significant advantage in setting up ambushes, cutting off British supply routes, and using the landscape to their benefit. Inability to control the land. Discuss how, despite occupying cities like New York and Philadelphia, the British were unable to control the countryside and were constantly harassed by guerrilla warfare. Psychological strain on British soldiers. Examine the mental and emotional toll the war took on British soldiers who were away from home, facing an uncertain and prolonged conflict. The impact of defeats. Detail how key defeats, such as the surrender at Yorktown, affected British morale and the will to continue fighting. Lack of clear objectives. Discuss how the British Army's lack of a clear and achievable objective made the fight feel endless and demoralizing for the troops. Rising discontent among troops. Highlight instances of discontent among British soldiers and officers, including protests and complaints about the conditions of war. Effect on British public opinion. Discuss how the prolonged war and its impact on soldiers. Morale led to growing public opposition to the war back in Britain, making it harder for the British government to continue the conflict.